And welcome back. Now we're going to take a look at the race for governor in New York, which really, frankly, isn't that much of a race at this point, certainly if you believe the polls. Andrew Cuomo, he's running for his third term. He's holding at the latest numbers a 22-point lead over Republican challenger Mark Molinaro. Cuomo also raking in an incredible amount of campaign cash. In fact, the Democrat and Chronicle, which is part of Gannett, calls Cuomo the $100 million man, as he's raised that much since he first started running for governor back in 2010. The paper, it spells out where the money has come from. Nearly $500,000 coming from companies that have received billions in state contracts, 80% coming from big donors, classified as those giving more than $10,000. Now, $1 in $5, it comes from LLCs, which have loopholes enabling them to donate more of that cash coming from groups set up by Glenwood Management. That is a giant real estate company that was embroiled in corruption scandals that we've covered at length on this program. Well, joining me now is one of the writers of that piece, Joseph Spector. He's an Albany bureau chief for LOHUD and the Journal News. Joe, thanks for the time. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for having me.
You know, next week, the Skeloses are going to be sentenced, and it's the end, if you will, of a spate of corruption trials that have dominated news. But as I've said, shockingly, it really hasn't seemed to hit the governor. But when you go back to when he began his term as governor, he chose Tammany Hall to say he was going to root out corruption and the evils of money flowing into politics and dictating policies. To that end, 8 years later, when you break down who gave them money, what have you found?
Well, as you noted, our investigation found that $100 million Governor Cuomo has raised since he started to run for governor in 2010, and we found that there's a number of connections between who gave and what they got. And you mentioned what the governor's pledges were when he first ran for office. You're right. He did announce his candidacy outside the Tweed Courthouse, and he said, you know, we're going to clean up Albany. It came after, as you recall, the resignation of Eliot Spitzer. David Patterson was the governor, but Cuomo came in and vowed to clean up Albany. You know, the state legislature and Cuomo have enacted about 5 or 6 different ethics packages since he took office. But time and again, here we are talking about scandals that have plagued the Capitol and state government.
To that end, Joe, you'll hear the governor say, hey, listen, people want to contribute to my campaigns here. I'm not one to turn them away, but it's never influenced policy or the awarding of government contracts. How much does that hold up?
Well, that's clearly what he says, and there is no quid pro quo between who contributes and what they receive. And, you know, and they'll also point out that we talk about the corruption scandals, whether it's Joe Percoco, his top aide, who was convicted and will be sentenced later this year. Elaine Caballeros is another one who is scheduled to be sentenced. He headed a lot of Cuomo's upstate economic development programs. He'll be sentenced to go through all of those. But in that, Cuomo will point out that he has never been implicated in these cases. Now, you ask his opponents, they will say, sure, New York has a pay-to-play culture, and Cuomo hasn't done enough to clean it up. $100 million that he's raised since 2010 is the most of any governor in the country, any governor, for that matter, who hasn't self-funded at least a portion of their campaign.
So the question people are going to say is, all right, you went through the numbers here, Joe. You broke down where this money came from, whether they came from LLCs, big donors here, et cetera. But did they get a return on investment? For those who wrote checks to the governor over the last 8 years and for this campaign, did they get contracts? What'd you find?
We did find that in a number of cases there were contracts that were given to people who contributed to the governor's campaign. Now, they'll point out not every single one got something in return, but we did point to a number of examples, and other media outlets have done this, that showed that if you have contributed, there are links between those who contributed and what they got in either state contracts or some are on boards. But, you know, his governor's supporters will say, listen, these are folks who support the governor's initiatives, support his agenda, and that's all there is to it.
But did we learn anything from the Buffalo Billions and certainly the Percoco scandal? I mean, you can take Silver and Skelos really and put those to the side, because whatever they did out of self-enrichment for them or family here had nothing to do with the governor. It may be a critique of government, but specifically with the Buffalo Billions and with Percoco, maybe there wasn't a quid pro quo, but certainly people seem to be paying for access.
in the case of Percoco, this was him taking bribes that benefited him, and his wife also had a job there. In the Buffalo Billion scandal, that was an alleged steering of contracts to people who contributed to the governor's campaign, and that led to the conviction of Elaine Calieros, the former head of the SUNY Polytechnic Institute. So yeah, both of those cases continue to be under scrutiny. There continues to be calls for better oversight, not only of the procurement programs in New York, how contracts are let out, but also New York's campaign finance laws. You know, New York has some of the most porous campaign finance laws in the country. You mentioned the LLC loophole. Companies can set up limitless number of LLCs and therefore be able to contribute above and beyond what would be allowed under normal circumstances.
And isn't that the dirty secret, Joe? Because, you know, people forget the whole Moreland Commission, which was set up to try and get to the bottom of who was doing what. The thing got shuttered. It was a story for maybe a week and then seemingly it vanished into the air. We've been talking, I mean, when 2 of the 3 men in the room were getting fitted for orange jumpsuits, right? And we're still talking about, as you accurately say, New York having one of the worst campaign finance systems that leads to so much of this. Yet here we are, governor's going to win, probably going away, and, you know, we'll seem to forget about it after November. Maybe not you or I, but it doesn't seem to resonate for whatever reason, even after all the bold-type names that have gone down.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. You know, going into this campaign season, one of the questions was, will this all come back on the governor? I mean, you had all the scandals, a lot of questions about the MTA and the subways. You can go down the list, upstate economic development programs, as we noted. The upstate economy has improved, but certainly not to the levels that a lot of people think it should. So you go down the list of things that have been criticisms of Cuomo, but no, here we are. He's well ahead. He has a lot of money still to spend. You noted a double-digit lead in the recent Quinnipiac poll this week. So it hasn't really resonated at this point. I mean, he has a lot of progressive, quote unquote, goals and things that he's accomplished. $15 minimum wage he points to, paid family leave, first largest state in the country to have same-sex marriage in 2011. He goes down the list of all the priorities and all the achievements he's had over 8 years, and by and large, people in a state where Democrats are outnumbering Republicans 2-1, he's well ahead.
And he certainly looks like he's going to coast in less than 3 weeks' time. Joe, I appreciate it. I appreciate yours as well. Thank you very much. Really interesting piece.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody, when we come back, we've been talking about the New York governor, Nate Silver of 538. He joins us after the break, one of the best prognosticators in the business when it comes to elections. He's going to tell us what he thinks about all the gubernatorial races that are on the ballot in November and help explain why those can be just as important as what happens in the House and the Senate. Stay with us.